Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar on A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, featuring Seth Klein as our distinguished guest speaker. Hello, Seth, and welcome to the Group of 78. My name is Roy Culpepper. I chair the Group of 78. I'll start by saying I'm making these introductory remarks in the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, as we discuss how to combat the climate crisis, including by eliminating our production and consumption of fossil fuels. We must recognize that Indigenous communities have, for many generations, stewarded the rivers, coasts, forests, and the land we inhabit today. We must learn from their example, respect their legacy, and support their quest for justice. A couple of announcements before we get down to business. First, if you haven't already done so, please register for and attend our annual policy conference starting next week on September the 23rd at 10 a.m. Our topic is Adaptation, Building Resilience in the Climate Emergency. The conference will take place in a series of webinars and keynotes over 8 days and will be followed by a concluding session to discuss key messages and policy recommendations. Please visit our website for more information and to register. Second, I'd like to point out that 1981 marked the point in time when a declaration was signed by 78 prominent Canadians advocating a bolder and more progressive foreign policy. That declaration led to the formation of the Group of 78, oriented to peace and nuclear disarmament, economic justice, and planetary survival. As you can see, the G78 has continued to provide a forum for cutting-edge discussions and advocacy on foreign policy to this day. In the spirit of that 1981 declaration, we are reaching out to other organizations working in the international policy sphere to launch a review of Canada's foreign policy after the new government is elected next week. We are also reaching out to our members and others for their candid ideas about the Group of 78, how we can improve, where we should be going in order to help take on the huge challenges for foreign policy in the 21st century. Now on to the main event. To help welcome and introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to call upon the Group of 78's board member and treasurer, Bruce Campbell, who surely needs no formal introduction, is well known by most people listening in today, is former executive director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He is adjunct professor, York University, Faculty of Environmental Studies, and senior fellow, Ryerson University Centre for Free Expression. He's the author of The Lac-Mégantic Rail Disaster, Public Betrayal, Justice Denied, published by James Lorimer in 2018. He is also the author of The Petropath Not Taken, Comparing Norway with Canada and Alberta's Management of Petroleum Wealth, published by CCPA in January 2013. Bruce, thanks for moderating today's discussion, and over to you.
Thanks, Roy. It's welcome to all the and especially to our distinguished guest, Seth Klein. It's a really a privilege to have you with us, Seth. Seth and I go back a long way. We were both from the early days, my early days at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and we decided 94, 95 to kind of expand the operation, which was pretty small. We didn't really have a provincial presence, and it just didn't seem to be working in a federal in a federal system not to have that component. And so, and we knew there were people in various provinces that were interested in setting up a policy research organization, and the people in BC were the first to kind of reach out, and they had found this amazing guy to kind of lead the foundation of the BC office, and that was Seth, and so he was the founding director of the office, and for the next 22 years. In fact, he kind of exceeded me because I left the CCPA at the beginning of 2017. So we have lots of good memories, and we continue to be comrades in arms. His book, A Good War: Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, which is what he will talk about today, is I had a chance to go over a draft when it was published about a year ago, right, Seth? So this would have been before that, and I knew the minute I read it that this was going to be a blockbuster of a book, and especially at this time of climate crisis and the warnings that we were getting from scientists and the need for government action. And it provided a blueprint or a pathway for mobilization. And so apart from what I've already said, I should update you on where Seth is. Kind of the centerpiece is the book and the reason for his being here today. But Seth is the team lead and director of strategy with the Climate Emergency Unit, and that's supported by or part of or a project of the David Suzuki Institute, which is not the Suzuki Foundation. So the Institute's a nonprofit, but not a charitable organization. So he is also, for those who don't know, a regular columnist with the National Observer and an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser in the Urban Studies program. And he, like I, continue to maintain a link to the CCPA. We're both research associates of the CCPA. So I think I've gone on long enough. You're all waiting to hear from Seth, so I'll hand it over to you, Seth.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I hope my internet is coming through okay. Roy was a little choppy, but you seem to be coming through okay, Bruce. I hope I am too. Thank you for that introduction. Yes, it is a year since my book came out. I'm glad you were as confident as you were that it would do well. I was racked with doubts, but it has gone very well. This is actually about the 100th event I've done with the book in the last year. It's great to be with you all, and thank you all for your interest and for making time this morning. I'm really happy to be with you. I'm joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, otherwise known as Vancouver. And I'm really very happy to have this chance to engage with the Group of 78 and to have this invitation from you. This is the first time I've done something with the Group of 78. Congratulations on your 40th anniversary. I feel a little connection with you. 40 years ago, I was only 13, and yet I knew of the Group of 78. I started my political activism as a teenager, the age of 14, 15, in the peace movement. And so while I was only 13 when you were founded, I actually knew Murray Thompson very well. And I knew a number of your founding signatories. I knew Don Baines at McGill. I knew Marion Dewar. I knew Ursula Franklin. I knew Maynard and Ann Gertler in Montreal. So So I do feel this connection with the group of 78, and I'm really happy to be doing this with you. So I've been asked to take about 20 minutes off the top to kick off this webinar with some overall ideas from the book, and then I look forward to some discussion with Bruce and the rest of you. I think that my book calls on us to adopt a new and different approach to the climate crisis than the one that we've been pursuing to date. And it does that because in the end, what we're doing simply isn't working. I'd like to begin my talks by sharing this image. Can you see that chart of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years? This is Canada's record. What can you say about it? To put this in the parlance that we have all come to know in the pandemic, we have failed to bend the curve. We have simply managed to flatline or plateau our emissions over the last 20 years, but they are not on a downward trajectory. They are not on a path to stave off what will be a horrific future for our children and grandchildren if we do not jolt this in some profound way and set us quickly on a downward trajectory at the speed and scale required. So my take is that we've run out the clock with these distracting debates about incremental changes, and where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we've accomplished precious little. And now here we all are staring down this harrowing gap between what the science says we urgently have to do and what our politics seems willing or capable of entertaining. And we need a new approach. My book's original twist, as the title suggests, is that it is structured entirely around lessons from the Second World War. And I'm going to say off the top, I didn't start off planning to write a war story. And as I alluded to already, you know, if you had told people that I knew as a teenager in the peace movement that I was going to write a war story, they'd be mightily surprised. That's where I cut my teeth politically. I am, in fact, the child of Vietnam War resistors. That is why I happen to be Canadian. And yet I believe that we need this kind of wartime approach. And I'm going to walk you through what that might look like. But the book project was, when I originally set out to write this book, it wasn't going to be about the Second World War. It was going to be about an exploration of that gap. How do we align our politics and economy with what the science says we urgently have to do to address the emergency on climate? And so the book is that. But in the original book outline, there was only going to be a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War, because I had long been intrigued by the war as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that work, delved into that research, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis. And it wasn't just that I saw parallels well beyond the economic. It was jolting my own thinking. You know, I've worked on the climate file for years, but it was making me look at that material with fresh eyes about what it means to actually be in emergency mode. But also, I ended up restructuring the entire book around those World War II lessons, because I see in that history this helpful and, in fact, hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across class and race and gender to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we retooled the entire economy twice, in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. And so each chapter of the book takes a piece of that. What does it mean to mobilize public opinion? How do you navigate confederation? What's the role of Indigenous people and social movements? What did we do for returning soldiers? And is there a model there for just transition? And what are the cautionary tales about emergency? What are the things that we don't want to repeat? The squashing of civil liberties, the internments, the poisoning of Indigenous lands. And I think most apt to your work and to the current emergency, the shameful response to refugees, because that will surely be one of the defining issues of the next 50 to 100 years. And how do we avoid repeating that shameful legacy of the past. So each chapter is sort of 1/3 history, 2/3 present, and jumps back and forth in time. I should say, this is my first book. It's certainly the most creative thing I've ever done. I spent 22 years with Bruce at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives writing policy reports. And, I think Bruce would agree. I think they were pretty good reports. I don't know that they were exactly gripping writing. And so when I set out to write this book, I met with a lot of writers who talked about the need to build narrative and story into a book and to connect with people's hearts as well as their heads. And I have to say that was excellent advice. And it has been striking to me, much as when I landed on this framework of structuring the book around the war, I knew it was a good device and jolted my thinking, as I say, but it's really only been since releasing my book over the last year that it has been remarkable to me how deeply resonant this 80-year-old story of World War II remains for so many Canadians. And as I've engaged with different audiences, I get to make a little mischief with them. Whether an audience is labor people or business people or Democrats or liberals or architects or journalists, I get to, or farmers, I get to dig into this story and point to the people who are important to that audience, who did something extraordinary at a time of emergency, and what they did is important to our sense of purpose and legacy in the present. So people who saw us through this other existential threat, people we admire, and I get to say, look what they did, these people who are important to you. And here we are again today. And who do you want to be? And that's been fun. Since releasing my book in September, in all of these interviews and talks, I invariably get asked, how do you know when a government is in emergency, in emergency mode? And in trying to answer that question, I've had to distill this 400-page book into what I call my 4 markers of when you know that a government has shifted into emergency mode. Although I should say that while they're written for governments, they really apply to any ministry, any sector, any large institution, and to any political party. So here we are in the final days of an election. I would invite you to think about these 4 markers against the platforms that are before us. So here, actually, I'm going to call up the markers so you can see them for a moment and see what I'm talking about. There they are. So the first marker of emergency mode is that a government spends what it takes to win. The second is that it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. The third is that it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. And the fourth is that it tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. During the Second World War, the Canadian government did all of these things. And I would say, if you reflect on those 4 markers, I actually think our government hit all of those markers in this pandemic. We can quibble about some of the timing and degree, but really they did all 4 of these things. But with respect to the climate emergency, so far anyway, neither our federal government nor any provincial government, it's not just that they're not hitting all of the markers. I would contend they hit none of the markers. So I want to walk you through these markers in one by one and say a little bit more about them. The book has more lessons than that. There's actually kind of 14 lessons in the book about from World War II for the present that I call my battle plan for mobilizing for the climate emergency. But I want to zero in on these 4 and one more that I'll share after, and then we'll open up for discussion. So that first marker, spend what it takes to win. So a benefit of an emergency mentality is that it forces governments out of an austerity mindset. So this year, for example, in response to the COVID emergency, Canada's debt to GDP ratio rose from about 30% to 50%. That's a big jump in a single year. It still pales in comparison to where we were at the end of World War II, where it was more than double that, well over 100%. And when C.D. Howe, who was the minister who oversaw Canada's wartime military production, was pressed about that ramp up in government spending, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter." And in order to finance the war effort, the government issued public victory bonds, and new forms of progressive taxation were brought in, including, by the way, a cap on profits. So the kind of profiteering that we have seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. And I think as we confront the climate emergency, we're going to need to employ similar tools. But if anything, I think the extraordinary public spending we have seen in this pandemic merely shows what could have been done in response to the climate emergency or poverty or homelessness all along. It turns out that when our governments recognize an emergency, the money is there. And just to give you one final comparison on this, that whole first year of the pandemic, the Bank of Canada was buying up federal government securities in order to finance the emergency response to the tune of $5 billion a week. In contrast, the Trudeau government is spending on climate a little more than $5 billion a year. So our governments aren't merely spending a little less than they should in the face of the climate emergency. They are spending less, probably by about a tenfold order of magnitude. So we can discuss this more if you like in Q&A. The second marker, create the economic institutions needed to get the job done. So during World War II, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that is just, to my mind, staggering. During those 6 years, Canada, with a population less than a third what it is today, produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the fourth largest air force in the world at the time. Here in my province, where in British Columbia, we struggle to build a single BC ferry anymore, just our shipyards built over 350 ships, again, from a base of almost nothing. And remarkably, the Canadian government, under the leadership of C.D. Howe, established 28 crown corporations to meet, expedite that those munition requirements of the war effort. Howe became remarkable to me. He was sort of seized with this task. And any time the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed doing, he created another crown corporation to get the job done. I should say, because I think your audience would appreciate this, that of all of the nice notes I got after my book came out, my favorites were that I heard from 3 grandchildren of C.D. Howe, who are all senior citizens themselves now, of course. But one of his grandsons said, "Thank you for rescuing the Keynesian legacy of our grandfather from the think tank that bears his name." So that one was a keeper for me. Similarly in the pandemic, I think we've witnessed the federal government, pivot in the senior bureaucracy at the Bank of Canada and Finance Canada, within just weeks, creating these audacious new programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy with a speed that few of us would have predicted. But in response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of this sort. So in contrast to all C.D. Howe's wartime creations, the Trudeau government has established 2 new crown corporations in its time in office, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and the other, I'm afraid to tell you, is the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. It's the one that makes us all the proud owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline from Alberta to my province. If our governments really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would quickly conduct an inventory of all of our conversion needs, just like C.D. Howe did, and determine how many heat pumps and solar arrays and wind farms and electric buses, etc., we're going to need to electrify virtually everything and end our reliance on fossil fuels. And then we'd see a new generation of public corporations to ensure that those items are manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. Third marker. Shifting from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. When I showed you that chart of the last 20 years, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions merely flatlining, why is that? I think a major reason is that if you survey all of our federal and provincial actions to date, almost all of them are voluntary. We encourage change. We incentivize change. We offer rebates. We send price signals. What we have decidedly not done is require change. We are trying to incentivize our way to victory, and it's not going to work. If we are going to meet the greenhouse gas targets that we urgently need to hit, we need to set clear near-term dates by which certain things will be required. For example, we would say you won't be able to buy a new fossil fuel vehicle as of 2025, not 2035, 25. We would mandate that all new buildings will not be allowed to tie into natural gas or use fossil fuels as of next year, not 2030, as they're talking about, next year. That's what my city in Vancouver is doing, by the way. We would ban the advertising of fossil fuel products, just like we do tobacco and cigarettes, right? That's how you would communicate that this is serious, which brings me to the fourth marker: tell the truth, rally the public at every turn. It takes leadership to mobilize the public. And in frequency and in tone, in words and in action, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And let me ask you, when you reflect on the climate plans of our federal government, is there anything about it that looks and sounds and feels like an emergency to you? And yet the leaders that we best remember from the Second World War were outstanding communicators who were forthright with the public about the gravity of the crisis and yet still managed to impart hope. And I think our government modeled that in the pandemic, right? The messages were ubiquitous. We got daily press briefings. We heard regularly from public health officials. The media took seriously its duty to provide necessary information on a daily basis. Government leaders and the media listened to science and health experts. None of that consistency and coherence, however, is present with respect to the climate emergency. And when our governments don't act as if the situation is an emergency, or worse, when they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure, they're effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. I want to mention one final lesson, and then we'll open this up. And it has to do with the lesson, comes up in war a lot, around leaving no one behind. There is a thread that runs through my book, which is that in order to attain real society-wide mobilization, you need social solidarity. And inequality is toxic to that social solidarity. You hear from some policy climate purists who say, you know, don't link what we have to do on climate to tackling inequality or all these other social justice problems. You know, don't weigh them down because this is complicated enough as it is. Don't hijack the issue. I think they're wrong. And I think they're wrong, first of all, because these issues are connected. The wealthier you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are to climate change and to climate policies. But mostly we need to link these issues because that's actually how we win. A successful mobilization requires that people make common cause across class and race and gender, and the public has to have confidence that sacrifices are being made by the rich as well as middle and modest income people. Interestingly, in the First World War, inequality and rampant, grotesque profiteering undermined that kind of social solidarity. It actually undermined recruitment efforts. It's partially why we had the conscription crisis. So consequently, at the outset of the Second World War, the King government took these really rather bold steps to lessen inequality. You know, and to limit excess profits. So they increased taxes on corporations from 18 to 40%. They didn't stop there. They put a cap on profits. They introduced Canada's first major income transfer program. So unemployment insurance comes in the war. The family allowance comes in the war. And the famous Marsh Report, this report that lays the whole architecture for the whole post-war welfare system, is written during the war and is offered up to Canadians as a pledge and a promise that the country they would come back to would look different and more just than the one they were leaving behind. That's when they get the mobilization. That's when they hit their recruitment numbers. And to me, that's the point. When you're asking people to share in a great undertaking, that's how you get everyone on the bus. And those kinds of measures have, I think, an historic echo today in the appeal of something like the Green New Deal. And the polling tells us that when ambitious climate action is linked to tackling inequality and a good jobs guarantee for fossil fuel workers, support for the climate policies doesn't go down, it goes dramatically up. And that's why I don't think when we look at party platforms, you can't separate a party's climate platform from what it's proposing to do to tackle inequality and enhance tax fairness. The public sees these as one and the same. So I've hit my 20-minute opener. I want to stop there. I'll just say this. These next 10 years are make it or break it for us and our kids and our grandkids. This is it. We are at a crossroads moment, just like we were in 39. And we all have to decide who we're going to be. I've made some comparisons to COVID in my remarks, and I want to highlight one difference between the pandemic and this climate crossroads moment. People talk about COVID fatigue, and that's real. And there's some people have responded to my thesis saying, look how quickly people tired of emergency and the pandemic in less than a year. And here I am asking that we spend multiple years in emergency mode to tackle the climate crisis. But here's the distinction. The things that we're called upon to do in response to the pandemic have been anathema to our social instincts. We're told to isolate, to stay home, and that's hard. The good news about the climate mobilization is that it calls on us to do precisely the opposite, to get out there and do something grand together. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Seth. Before you, as this was getting underway, I was scrambling around for a copy of your book to put up on the screen, because I'm sure I bought well over half a dozen books to give as presents last Christmas, and I'm sure I'll do the same. So I just want to say what that encapsulation that Seth gave you in over a 20-minute period should serve as a taste, and I really urge you to go out and buy the book. You won't regret it.
Bruce, I just put a link to the book in the chat there. I should have done that before.
So I just want to say that for those who are participating, if you have a question for Seth, put it in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to it. I'll start off asking myself. I was kind of mulling over what I should add, kind of up around. By the way, I thought the from Cedar's grandson was right on. That's precious. We've got different. We've got a variety of election platform commitments from the political parties. We had also an analysis of those platforms by, I believe he's a University of Victoria professor. It was in Policy Options. That's where I saw
SFU.
it.
He's with us. He's SFU.
He's at SFU, and he had he rated them and had. And gave us his assessment of which were the which party had the best climate plan. And I'm wondering what your assessment is and how you saw his assessment and in turn your own assessment of the party's climate plans.
Yeah. So you're referring to Mark Jackard's rating of the platforms, and he and I have had a bit of a back and forth now. I'll share with you my critique of, because we're not going to be able to go into great length about it, but I've just put in the chat my critique of Mark's ratings. And this morning, Mark had a response to mine, so you can find it all on the Observer. He and I obviously don't agree. Mark did a rating of the climate sincerity, he called it. Those were his words, of the platforms. He rated the Liberals at an 8 out of 10, the Conservatives at a 5 out of 10, the Greens as a 4 out of 10, and the NDP as a 2 out of 10. My piece takes issue with a number of assumptions in his methodology, but I don't want to lose people in the weeds here. I'll just say this. I think he made an error in what he put in the model. First of all, I think the Liberals getting a rating of 8 is nonsensical to me, and I elaborate on the reasons why. the Conservatives have a lower ambition and roll back a number of what the Liberals are planning on doing. So they get bumped down to a 5. I kind of get that. The NDP platform entirely builds upon what the Liberals are doing. They have said they will continue with the carbon tax scheduled increases up to $170, which is the Liberal centerpiece. But then they say all of these additional things they plan on doing. And for that sin, Jackard marks them only a 2. Riddle me that. I think in the end, what he's mostly done is his main criteria has been how credible are the party plans for attaining the targets that they themselves have set. That seems to me a rather unusual criteria. It feels a bit more like a student self-assessment than a sincerity rating. But people can read our pieces and decide for themselves. But on your larger question of how would I rate the platforms, here's what I would say. I gave you my 4 markers of emergency. Plus, so spend what it takes to win, create new economic institutions to get the job done, move from voluntary to mandatory, tell the truth, and a 5th one, understand the links with inequality. And an overarching one, which is that plans need to look and sound and feel like emergencies and invite the population to join in a grand undertaking. On that basis, I would say none of the party platforms are true and genuine climate emergency plans. I actually think the Green and NDP plans are stronger than the Liberal plan. I think they go further on each of those markers than the Liberals do, but still not sufficiently so. It's a bit hard to assess the Green one because they haven't tabled the costing of their plan, and so spend what it takes to win. I don't know. They don't have the numbers. But they are stronger in terms of saying we actually have to stop increasing the expansion of fossil fuel production. I think the Greens are most forthright on that point. But let me pivot a bit to your question, Bruce. Given that none of the parties have an actual emergency plan, and given that everything now must be about ambition and speed and scale, my electoral advice to people is a bit different. I think the path to victory on this existential threat is actually very narrow. That's the bad news. And when I look at that path, I see 2 important things. One is I desperately hope we re-elect a minority government. And I say that because if majority governments get to govern with impunity for 4 years. Look at what happened with C12, the net zero Accountability Act that the Liberals introduced earlier this year. The first iteration of it was terrible. That would have been the law under majority government. Because it was a minority government, they had to make some concessions to the NDP, and it got a little stronger. Still not fantastic, but a little stronger. But mostly I like minority governments because they give us ongoing openings to push for greater ambition, because the government has to continue to win our support on an ongoing basis. Otherwise, somebody will trigger an election. But the second piece of my advice is this. We need to elect a larger contingent of true climate emergency champions, people who are in it to win it on this fight of our lives. The good news is there are a lot of such people running. And so my invitation to people is find your climate champion, the people who both get it and who have a reasonable chance of winning in your riding, and get behind those people. And if you don't have such a person in your riding, find one in a neighboring riding and spend these next few days doing everything you can to get them elected.
Question from a participant asking, to get off fossil fuels, will we really be able to replace all that energy with renewables such as solar and wind? Isn't there an ecological, maybe economic limit to the amount of lithium and rare earth metals that we could reasonably mine? So that's one question if you want to take on.
Yeah. It's a really good and important question. So first of all, every form of energy production has environmental impacts. Some are worse than others. And the fossil fuel one in particular, one is now an existential threat to us. And so we have to end it and replace it with forms of renewable. There is modeling that has been done by Mark Jacobson at Stanford and others that say, yes, we can indeed electrify everything and do it with those renewables. The one thing I would point out is that often when people think, oh, if we electrify our homes and we electrify all of our vehicles, the additional demand for electricity will be through the roof. That's not true. It will be greater than it is now, but not nearly as much larger as many people assume. That's because in part that fossil fuels are so phenomenally inefficient when it comes to the production of energy. They're handy in many ways, relatively easy to extract and transport, but you lose so much energy in the production of power from fossil fuels compared to electricity. Also, a huge amount of what we produce in fossil fuels today is actually used to fuel the extract. Like in my province of British Columbia, most of the extraction of natural gas is used to power the tar sands in Alberta. And if we stopped doing that, we wouldn't need that energy. So there's a variety of, and so many of the modern things like electric heat pumps are so much more efficient than traditional baseboard electric and that kind of thing. I don't want to get too stuck in the details, but I would say this. I think embedded in the question is another important point, which is, I was trying to allude to this in my final comments of my opener. The answer isn't just to electrify everything we do now, for every fossil fuel vehicle to become an electric vehicle. We actually have to transform how we live, how we design communities, how we get around, in ways that shift from an individualization to more of a collective thing. It's about moving to buses. It's about building communities where we can walk and roll to work in the things that we need, so that our overall demand for power is reduced.
Okay, I'm going to combine the next three questions. First is, can you say something about the role of science during World War II? And also, can you comment on the ironies inherent in the fact that C.D. Howe lost the 1957 election for the Liberals as a result of invoking closure on the Great Pipeline debate?
Oh, who asked that question?
His name, Lawrence Cumming.
A great question, Lawrence.
Yeah. and then from Diane Marshall, if we had a national war model to fight climate change, would the old growth logging at Fairy Creek and the ongoing extraction of tar sands, oil and gas and pipelines, delivering them automatically be ended or reduced?
Okay, there's a lot there. Repeat the last question. What's the last question?
Yeah, sorry. It's if we had a national war model to fight climate change, would the old growth logging at Fairy Creek and the ongoing extraction of tar sands, oil and gas and pipelines, delivering them be automatically be ended or reduced? It's a little.
Yeah, there's two questions in that one, so it's really four questions. Okay, let me take a stab at this. Obviously, the role of science was really important in World War II, and best epitomized in the thing that this organization was founded to challenge, was the creation of the atom bomb. But let me take a different tact on this. The point I am trying to make is more on the production side. What that one story shows us is that speed and scale, like we cannot imagine, is indeed possible when we treat something like an emergency. I gave you the example of the shipyards in British Columbia. The shipyards in British Columbia had all gone dormant in the Depression. There were no naval architects left. So when we realized that we had to ramp everything up, we had to import that expertise, so not scientific, but engineering expertise. We had to recruit and train up a whole bunch of people. The Vancouver shipbuilders local went from being about 200 guys to the single largest union local in the country. Let me give you an example out of automobiles about speed and scale. In Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. In February of 1942, 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit. And for the next 4 years, their production and sale was basically illegal in the United States. So that didn't happen because of the voluntary goodwill and patriotism of the big three automakers. It happened because they were directed. But when that direction comes, the speed and scale of these transitions, aided by science, can be phenomenal. The thing is, when it comes to decarbonization and electrification, the technology that we need, with a few notable exceptions like air travel, is already there. It's sitting on the shelf. Wonderful things are happening. The problem is that at the moment, they're a side hustle. If we're going to scale them up at the speed required, it has to be state-led and directed. What do they do in their last budget? They offer a 50% tax cut to the companies that will produce these technologies that we need. And some companies will take on that, but not really at the speed and scale required. They are still trying to incentivize their way to victory. And by the way, I'm nowhere near, but I'm fairly certain that production of electric heat pumps and solar panels is way easier than airplanes and ships. To Lawrence's question about CD, Lawrence, the point you made, for some idiotic reason, I buried that in a footnote in the book. But a few months ago, I had a Zoom chat with Jonathan Wilkinson, our environment minister, until the election was called. And I thought I would, I made the point to him that I thought there were certain, could he be our CD Howe? And they have certain similarities. They both came from the private sector. They've both been CEOs of technology-based private companies and had moved into elected office. But I shared with him that after this very impressive 22-year career in elected office, the political undoing of C.D. Howe was what you said. It was a pipeline. It was him pushing the Trans-Canada pipeline through the House of Commons and invoking closure, and he lost the election in 1957. But Mr. Wilkinson didn't see the humor in that the way I did. To the last question, every sector has to go through a transition. So forestry actually has a future in a when we are serious about climate. Wood has a future, but it needs to be transformed. It needs to be zero emission, and it needs to not use anymore old growth that we desperately need to store carbon. But it can be managed in a different way when we are serious about this. But there are a few industries that don't have a future when we're serious about this, that actually had to be managed for wind down. And the fossil fuel industries are those. It doesn't mean that we have to turn off the tap tomorrow. It does mean we have to stop expanding. And it does mean we have to have a serious plan and schedule to actually wind them down.
Next question from, I guess it's from, whoops, I think I lost it. Okay. World War II was about survival in the short term. COVID was about survival in the short term. How do you explain the climate emergency in the short term? You did not include a slide showing how the climate is an imminent catastrophe.
Good question too. So the curse of climate is that it moves in slower motion than COVID or World War II. That said, the public increasingly does understand that it's an emergency, especially after the summer that we've had. But even 2 years ago, when I was writing my book and I commissioned some polling from Abacus Research that tested whether or not people understood this to be an emergency, I found a majority of the public did. And in many respects, what I see and found is a public that is ahead of our politics when it comes to seeing this as a threat that it is. But I want to press back on one point. Often when I was writing and sharing my thesis with people would often say some variation of what you asked, which is, yeah, but in World War II, everyone understood the threat to be clear and present, and now it's different. No, they didn't. Here's actually what I find as I look at my study of World War II and our shared experience with the pandemic and the climate emergency. And it's this: every emergency begins with a period of denial. Every emergency begins with a period of denial. World War II did, right up to the 11th hour. This was a population or leadership that did not want to do this. And we can all remember 20 months ago being in denial together as we started to hear about this new virus. And we were all in denial about how it was going to upend our lives. But in all of these cases, some alchemy between and leadership that shifts the public zeitgeist into emergency mode. In World War II, it was probably the fall of France. That's serious. But it was also the leadership that brought the public on board, that worked hard to bring the public on board in ways I describe in the book. And in the pandemic, I don't know about you, you know what I remember? I remember when they canceled the NBA season. Bruce, I don't even watch basketball. But I remember thinking, whoa, they canceled the whole season. This must be serious. But it was also the leadership. I remember seeing our prime minister in front of his house every morning, communicating, this is an emergency. In the climate context, the events are happening. People get it, right? The extreme weather events are those events. Unhelpfully, they don't all happen in the same place at the same time. But people get that the emergency is now, not sometime in the future somewhere else. It is here, it is now. But the leadership hasn't happened yet. It's not modeling what it means to be in emergency mode yet, but it will.
Okay, so two questions, both from people who have read your book and they've called it brilliant and phenomenal. And one question is, what is our next step? And the other question is, if this election leaves us with a Liberal government and therefore a prime minister who thinks we need Trans Mountain to combat climate change, how can we move forward in emergency mode as needed when we'll be lacking the political will at the federal level?
Well, as I say in the book, this is the awkward period of our interregnum. This is the period of our phony war, and it's no fun. To be at a time when our governments say they get it, and yet they clearly don't get it. But as with the phony war period in the war, it's going to end. The only question is if it's going to end in time. But it is going to end. And already there are interesting shifts. I mean, I do take some solace from the fact that already every climate platform in this election is stronger than the one just 2 years ago. Every party feels compelled to present what they hope will be seen as a credible plan. And there is one important pivot that's happened with the Liberals. All of this time since they were first elected 6 years ago, they have not wanted to touch oil and gas. They keep saying, in fact, the worst, they kept repeating an untruth, which was that we could be serious about climate and still expand oil and gas. Oil and gas is the source of 26% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, that flatline chart I showed you, when you actually dig a little deeper into that, what you actually see is that we are lowering our emissions in most sectors and in most provinces, and all of it's getting undone by the expansion of fossil fuels. For the first time, 3 weeks ago, the Liberals said, if reelected, we will bring in a cap on the emissions of the oil and gas sector and a schedule to lower them. That's a change. I don't know how credible I find it yet, but it's a change. I'm not to be Pollyanna with your question, about how optimistic I am or am not. I told you the path to victory is narrow. That's the honest truth. But I do feel like if we can secure another minority, if we can elect more climate champions, look, let me be frank with the NDP too. We had a minority government the last 2 years, and the NDP did not make bold, brash action on climate a key negotiation point for securing their support in the House. Next time, if there's another minority that relies on the NDP, we need a squad of climate champs in there who will demand that the climate emergency be a core plank of any agreement to offer their confidence in the House.
Okay, we're getting close to the end of our time. There's one question deals with how to deal with all the disinformation on social media. And the other one asks, how can World War II inform us on how to make degrowth, unquote, a socially and politically acceptable?
Good questions. And I'm hoping before I leave you too, I know you have a conference coming up on adaptation. I want to say something about that too. Let me deal with the degrowth first piece. I'm not sure you'll like my answer. I find the degrowth debate a bit distracting. And I say, and here's my reason. I think that when we get serious about confronting the climate emergency, when we see the level of spending, government spending that's going to be required, and create these crown corporations to get the job done and transition all of these things in our society, it's probably actually going to be net positive for some time on growth, and it will banish unemployment from our midst. Whether or not long, I think where you and I probably agree is that all of this has to be done in a way that with less material throughput than we've had in the past. But I'll leave that there. The media question is a really great one. Too, it's the social media, and it causes me some distress. And we are a more fractured society in destructive ways through that. But here's the thing. The polling is the polling. And what the polling tells us is what I told you before, which is notwithstanding all that misinformation, a majority of the public sees the climate as an emergency and wants to see more bold climate action than what our governments have offered us to date. I would love to see a campaign after this election of all of us directed towards the media, but the CBC in particular. That fourth marker, tell the truth, that's for the media as well. And I make the point in the book, the CBC was created 3 years before the war, thank goodness, and could reach the vast majority of Canadians and rallied Canadians every night. It was the voice of Lauren Green at the time. Some of you remember Green Hollywood after Fernando, or if Chavaney's like me, he was the original commander at Dama in the first Battle of Galactica. But he started as a newsreader on CBC in World War II. Canadians affectionately knew him as the voice of doom, they called him. But he was part of rallying the public. Edward R. Murrow and the CBS News team in the US are credited with helping to bring about a 20 percentage point shift in US public opinion between the war beginning and when the US eventually joined. So I think if the CBC and their morning news radio shows can give us hourly sports and business reports, surely to God, they could give us a morning climate emergency report and tell us every morning how this fight for our lives is unfolding at home and abroad. That's what I'd love to see. Can I say a final thing about adaptation? Let's just jump right in. I think it's great you're at this conference, and adaptation is super important. And I probably don't give it enough attention in my book as I should, although I do specify that a bunch of the spending we need is on adaptation infrastructure. There is some consciousness to the fact that I don't talk about adaptation. I do worry a bit that, in the psychology of the moment in which we find ourselves, if we talk too much about adaptation, we're sort of throwing in the towel on what we have to do on the mitigation front, on actually ending our emissions. So it's a delicate balance to make sure that people stay rallied. We have to rally the public. That's the point about the psychology of the moment we're in. And they are, of course, connected. The things that we need to do to mitigate, to reduce our emissions, also help with adaptation. And let me make this final point from my home province. In my province in June, almost 600 people died in a week in the heat dome event, mostly frail seniors. Talk about the need for adaptation. If we had already converted their homes and had electric heat pumps in them in order to get rid of the natural gas in their homes, they'd all be alive, because those heat pumps also provide air conditioning.
Well, on that note, unless you have I see Roy. Do you want to intervene here?
Yes,
Roy?
if I may.
Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning adaptation, which is the topic of our conference. It's very well the metaphor of war, because adaptation is fighting on the home front. We couldn't have won the war in Europe anyway without sirens and air raid shelters. Mm-hmm. The population would have been obliterated, right? So that was a very important dimension of the war effort. But my question really had to do with the global effort. We can and we must do everything in Canada in order to bring greenhouse gas emissions in this country down and down and down to the levels that they need to be. But even if Canada does all of that, even if Canada is a superstar, other countries in the world have to do their bit too. And how do we work on a global level with colleagues, with civil society organizations, with climate champions to ensure that other countries are pushing as much as they could? This is where the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty comes in. And I was hoping you could say a few words about that.
Yes, great question, Roy. Well, all wars are won with allies. And I'm a big fan of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mentioned it in the book, and actually in the time in between when the book was being edited and in production and before it came out, I spent some months working on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and trying to get it endorsed by a number of cities. So I'm a great fan of it, in particular because I think one of the dynamics that it addresses, so first of all, the Paris Treaty, the Paris Agreement doesn't mention fossil fuels. It's entirely on the demand side, not on the supply side. It's a terrible omission. And this treaty tries to fix that. But also, I like the treaty because it you guys are foreign policy people, it helps us escape the prisoner's dilemma, right? That each country wants to do the right thing, but they're afraid that if they will, somebody else will defect and fill the void. And so the treaty says, everybody stand down. And so that, I think, is helpful. But I also want to say this, the book is about Canada. And when I do interviews, the question that almost always comes up is, yeah, but we're little, it's just Canada. What difference would it make? I think, and this is what I want to hear in those CBC morning reports. First of all, we have to do this knowing that we are doing it with millions of other people of goodwill around the world who are having the same fight with their governments. And we have to trust that we're all going to do our bit. But one of the things I would say, while Canada is a small country with a population and with a small population, we are the fourth and sixth largest producers of oil and gas in the world. And our emissions doesn't count what we export and gets burned somewhere else. So we have to get our house in order. But here's where I love my war metaphor again. In World War II, Canada didn't wait on the United States. We entered the war 2 years earlier. We spent most of those 2 years as the only country in the Western Hemisphere in the war. And we were smaller then, less than a third the size we are today. And at the end of the war, nobody questioned the value and importance of Canada's contributions. I think that's the spirit we need to bring to this fight. And I'll say this final thing. We all of us who follow this issue wrestle with despair that we're going to do this in time. That is the ambiguous time in which we live. But there is, here's where I take a little hope. Canada was a population of about 11 million people in World War II. From that population, over 1 million Canadians enlisted. I mean, that just blows my mind. And over 1 million were directly employed in military production. Of those million who enlisted, you know what they didn't know? They didn't know if they would win, at least for the first few years. And they did it anyway. And then they surprised themselves. And I think that's the spirit we need to bring to this.
Thank you, Roy. And I think this brings this webinar to close. It's been, to quote a couple of participants, brilliant and phenomenal. For me, it's been inspiring and insightful. And the fact that you've done this over 100 times, I think, is encouraging. And I want to thank you again from the bottom of my heart, and I hope that this gets played over and over again. And I know that it will be taped and it will be on the G78 website, and I'm sure it will get widespread attention, in addition to the participants who have pretty much stayed with us all the way. There have been no fall off. So it was a riveting performance. Thank you, Seth. See you down the road.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.